The gun was already pressed against Edwin Bishop's temple when Hazel Wainwright realized she was in love with him. It happened in the span of a single, suffocating heartbeat, the kind that stops time, that drains color from the world and leaves everything gray and too sharp at the edges. The man holding the weapon was Clarence Potts, and his hand was shaking, which was somehow worse than if it had been steady. Shaking hands meant unpredictable fingers. Shaking hands meant accidents. And Hazel had not come all the way from St. Louis, Missouri, through 3 weeks of dust and rattlesnakes and a stagecoach that smelled like old tobacco and despair, only to watch the man she had married 6 days ago get killed in his own barn. "You tell her the truth," Clarence snarled, his lips peeled back like a dog cornered against a fence. "You tell her what you did to my family, Bishop, or I swear before God and the devil both, I will put a hole through your skull right here and let her watch." Edwin did not flinch. That was the thing about him that Hazel had noticed first, before she had noticed his eyes or the quiet steadiness of his hands, or the way he always waited for her to sit down before he did. Edwin Bishop did not flinch from things. He stood in the lantern light of the barn with hay dust swirling around him and a gun pressed to his head, and he looked of all things tired, not afraid, tired, as if this moment had been coming for a very long time and he had simply grown exhausted of dreading it. "Hazel," he said, and his voice was the same voice he used when he asked her if she wanted sugar in her coffee, low and even and real. "Go back inside." "She stays," Clarence snapped. Hazel stayed, not because Clarence told her to. She stayed because her legs had forgotten how to move and because she needed to understand what she was looking at. She had known this man for 6 days. She had agreed to marry him after 3 letters and a photograph, and a feeling she could not fully explain, a feeling that something about his careful, deliberate words on paper spoke to a part of her that nothing else had reached in 26 years of careful, deliberate living. She had not known about dark pasts. She had not known about secrets buried in the red dirt of Laramie County, Wyoming, in the year 1882. She had not known about Clarence Potts, who was now weeping openly while holding a gun to her husband's head and saying things that made the barn feel like it was slowly shrinking around all of them. She had not known any of it. And so she stood in the hay-scented dark and made herself look at Edwin Bishop's face and asked herself the only question that mattered in that moment. Did she believe him to be the man Clarence was describing? The answer that came back was not simple. It was not clean or convenient or kind to her peace of mind. But it was honest. And Hazel Wainwright had always been constitutionally incapable of lying, even to herself. She did not know what Edwin had done. But she knew she was not ready to lose him. 3 weeks earlier, she had been standing on a platform at the St. Louis Union Depot with a single trunk, a reticule containing $42, and a train ticket that represented the single most terrifying decision of her adult life. She was 26 years old, the daughter of a bookseller who had died the previous winter and left behind nothing but debts and a shop full of volumes that no one in St. Louis seemed particularly interested in buying. Her mother had passed when Hazel was 12. She had a cousin in Kansas City who had offered her a room in exchange for domestic labor, framed as charity but feeling very much like servitude. Or there was the advertisement. She had found it folded inside a copy of a Harper's Weekly magazine left behind on a bench in the reading room of the public library. It was not the first matrimonial advertisement she had ever seen. They were common enough. The frontier, a constant hungry mouth wanting women willing to brave distance and uncertainty for the promise of a stable life. Most of them were perfunctory, seeking woman of sound constitution and agreeable temperament. Widow preferred. Cooking skills required. Edwin Bishop's advertisement had been different. She still had it, tucked inside the cover of the book she carried in her trunk. She had read it so many times she could have recited it from memory. Rancher in Wyoming territory, established, honest, not given to drink or cruelty. Seeking a partner in the true sense of the word, not a housekeeper or a decoration. I have land and a working cattle operation and a house that is too quiet. I'm not a man who makes promises easily, but the ones I make I keep. I will treat you with respect and give you time to decide if this life suits you. I ask only for honesty in return. Write to Edwin Bishop, Red Creek, Wyoming Territory. That word. Partner, it had lodged in her chest like a warm coal and refused to leave. She had written to him. He had written back within 10 days, which, even accounting for the mail, was faster than she expected, which told her something about how often he had been watching for a reply. His letter was 2 pages long, written in a precise and slightly formal hand, and it told her practical things: the acreage, the number of cattle, the name of the nearest town, which was a place called Brentwood, population 400 and growing. But between the practical things were other things. He told her that the sky in Wyoming was unlike any sky he had seen elsewhere, and that he had lived in 3 territories before settling here, and had not planned to stay until he woke up one morning, and simply could not imagine leaving. He told her that he had a horse named Solomon, who was extraordinarily opinionated about everything. He told her that he read when he could, mostly histories and occasionally a novel if one came his way, and that he had no objection to a house full of books if she was inclined toward them. She had written back the same day she received his letter. She had never done anything that fast in her life. By the 3rd letter they had agreed, carefully and mutually, and with a kind of grave practical honesty that suited them both, to proceed. She would come to Wyoming. They would be married. If the arrangement proved unbearable for either party, they would address it honestly and without rancor. She appreciated that he included himself in the possibility of dissatisfaction. Most men in these arrangements assumed the uncertainty was entirely the woman's. The train to Cheyenne took 3 days. Then the stagecoach north to Brentwood took another 2, and it was the longest 2 days of her life, rattling through a landscape so enormous and indifferent that she felt herself becoming smaller with every mile, not in a diminishing way, but in the way that sometimes, when you encounter something genuinely vast, you shed the things that were only ever illusions of importance. He met her at the stage depot in Brentwood on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. She recognized him from the photograph: tall, lean, somewhere in his early 30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that suggested someone who did not smile easily. He was wearing a clean shirt, and what she would later learn were his good boots, which he had polished the night before, a fact she discovered only because one of the ranch hands mentioned it later with the particular delight men take in teasing each other about things that matter. He shook her hand when she stepped down from the stage. Not because he was cold or formal, she understood later, but because Edwin Bishop was someone who did not take things without being invited to, including the casual physical contact that others assumed was their right. "Miss Wainwright," he said. "Mr. Bishop," she said. They looked at each other for a moment in the afternoon light, doing the very human thing of comparing the 3-dimensional person to the imagined version and recalibrating rapidly. She thought, "He is quieter than his letters." He thought, she later told him, that she seemed more settled than he had expected, more at home in herself. They were married 2 days later at the office of a justice of the peace named Harold Quint, who smelled of bay rum and appeared mildly bored by the whole enterprise. There was no celebration beyond a meal at the town's single restaurant, a place called McCarthy's, where the beef was good and the pie was extraordinary. She had the apple, he had the cherry. They talked for 2 hours, and she thought, with a cautious and carefully contained delight, that she had not made a mistake. The ranch was 11 miles outside of Brentwood along a road that turned to mud in rain and dust in drought, and was currently in late September, somewhere between the two. The house was larger than she had expected, built of timber and stone, 2 stories, with a porch that wrapped the front and one side. It was not beautiful the way places in engravings were beautiful. It was functional and solid and spoke of someone who had built it with the intention of staying. She had her own room. He had been very clear about this in his letters, and she had appreciated it then, and appreciated it even more when she stood in the doorway of the room he had prepared for her, and saw that he had placed a small shelf above the writing desk and stocked it with 3 books. One of them was a history of the Roman Empire. One was a novel by George Eliot. One was a slim volume of poetry by Walt Whitman. She stood there for a long time with her hand on the door frame. He appeared at the end of the hallway looking somewhere between anxious and determinedly casual. "I guessed," he said, "on the books. You can tell me if I guessed wrong." She turned to look at him. "Middlemarch," she said. "You chose Middlemarch. I have not read it," he admitted, "but it seemed like the kind of book someone who was serious about things might value." "I have read it twice," she said, "and I left my copy behind because the trunk was already too heavy." Something eased in his expression, something that had been held slightly braced. "Then it was a good guess," he said. "It was a very good guess," she said. Those first 6 days were careful and tentative, and full of the particular kind of electricity that exists between two people who are intensely aware of each other, while pretending to be entirely focused on practical matters. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, the early mornings, the smell of coffee that Edwin always had ready before dawn, the 3 ranch hands named Tom, Gideon, and a young man of 19 named Alfie who had the disposition of an optimistic golden retriever, and reminded Hazel powerfully of the kind of person she had been before life got complicated. She learned that Edwin was methodical and fair, that his men respected him, that he rarely raised his voice and never needed to. She learned that he was up before sunrise every morning and that he read every night before sleep, and that he had a habit when he was thinking hard about something of pressing the back of his thumb against his lower lip, which she found, against all reasonable expectation, to be utterly distracting. She learned that something happened to Edwin Bishop's face when he looked at her when he thought she was not looking back. She learned this on the 3rd day, quite by accident, when she glanced up from the kitchen garden and found him watching her from the corner of the barn, with an expression that he shut down the moment their eyes met, like a lamp being cupped against the wind. She turned back to the garden and stood very still for a moment. She thought, "This is either going to be the most important thing that ever happened to me, or it is going to break something I will not be able to fix." She had not yet decided which. On the evening of the 6th day, Hazel had gone out to the barn to bring Solomon an apple, which she had been doing since the 2nd day because Solomon had the equine equivalent of an imperious personality and had decided she was acceptable. She liked the horse enormously. Edwin had watched her make friends with Solomon with an expression of deep and silent amusement that he controlled quite well but not perfectly. She had been in the barn perhaps 10 minutes when she heard footsteps, and then the barn door opened, and it was not Edwin. It was Clarence Potts. He was a man somewhere in his 40s, weathered and rough-edged, with the kind of face that had once probably been handsome and was now only hard. He smelled of whiskey, and something underneath the whiskey that was older and less clean. He looked at her, and she could see that he had not expected her, had expected to find Edwin alone, and that her presence had thrown his calculation off in a way that made him dangerous. "You the wife," he said. It was not a question. "I am," she said, and she kept her voice level because her mother had once told her that in any situation involving a strange man and uncertainty, the worst thing you could do was show fear. "And you are Clarence Potts," he said. "My family had a ranch about 30 miles north of here. Had." He said that last word with a particular violence, biting it off at the end like cutting a rope. "Until Bishop happened to it." She heard the barn door behind Clarence and turned to see Edwin standing in the opening, and everything in his face had gone absolutely still. The stillness was worse than the shaking hand that came next, when Clarence pulled the gun. And now here they all were, in the lantern light and the dust and the particular suspended horror of a moment that could end in one of several ways, and most of them were bad. "Edwin," Hazel said, and she was surprised by how steady her voice was. "Tell him. Whatever it is, tell him. And tell me." Something shifted in Edwin's face, a kind of resignation that looked, from the inside she imagined, like relief. The relief of a secret that no longer has to be carried alone, even if the uncovering of it is terrible. "Clarence," Edwin said, and his voice was careful and deliberate, each word placed like a foot on uncertain ice. "I owe you an explanation. I have owed it to you for 2 years. Put the gun down and I will give you all of it." "I did not come here for explanations," Clarence said, but the gun lowered perhaps 2 inches, which was not much but was something. "No," Edwin said. "You came here because you want someone to look you in the eye and tell you the truth about what happened and why, and you deserve that, but you will not get it while I am calculating whether you are about to shoot me. So put the gun down. I am not going anywhere." The silence stretched. Somewhere outside, a night bird called. Solomon shifted his weight in his stall with a great rustling sound, as if he too were waiting. Clarence lowered the gun. He sat down on a hay bale and put his elbows on his knees and pressed his hands over his face and made a sound that was not quite crying, but was close enough to it that Hazel felt her heart crack a little along a seam she had not known was there. Edwin sat down on the other side of the barn, and Hazel sat beside Edwin, close enough that her shoulder was touching his arm, and she was not sure which of them she was trying to support, but she did not move away. "Start from the beginning," she said. Not to anyone in particular, to the situation, to the truth which had been hiding in this barn long enough. What Edwin told them took the better part of an hour, and it was not a simple story, and it did not reflect entirely well on him, which she had already suspected from the quality of his silence when Clarence had first appeared in the doorway. 2 years earlier, Edwin had partnered with a man named Robert Crail, a land agent out of Cheyenne, to acquire 2 adjacent parcels of land that were being sold through a territorial land office settlement process land that had formerly been part of a larger holding that had gone into debt. Edwin had needed the additional grazing land and had the capital. Crail had the legal connections and the paperwork expertise. It had seemed straightforward. What Edwin had not known, or had not bothered to verify as thoroughly as he should have, was that one of those parcels, the northern one, still had a legitimate occupancy claim on it. A prior claim, filed years earlier under a different administration, belonging to the Potts family, who had been running a small cattle operation there since 1876. The claim was buried in the records, poorly cross-referenced by a territorial office that was perpetually understaffed and overworked, and Crail had either missed it or, and this was the possibility that had eaten at Edwin for 2 years, had known about it and not said anything because the commission was better if both parcels sold. By the time the error was discovered, the Potts family had received notice to vacate and had done so under protest, believing themselves to be powerless against a transaction that had the territorial land office's seal on it. They had lost their home, their operation, 2 years of work, and Clarence's wife, Eleanor, had died the following winter in Cheyenne where they had relocated, and Clarence blamed it on the upheaval. Blamed the loss of the land, the strain, the cold winter in a city that was not home. Whether that causation was accurate was unknowable, but Hazel understood immediately and completely why Clarence believed it, because grief always needs a place to put itself, and the need is not diminished by the question of logical precision. Edwin had discovered the truth of his culpability about 8 months after the fact, when a different attorney reviewing his land titles flagged the discrepancy. He had gone to Crail, who had admitted to knowing about the conflict but had framed it as a minor technicality. Edwin had severed the partnership immediately and then spent the following year trying to locate Clarence Potts to make it right, but Clarence had moved twice and was not, understandably, receiving correspondence from addresses associated with the man who had taken his land. "I should have found you sooner," Edwin said. He was looking directly at Clarence, and his voice had none of the evasion that she imagined some men might employ. There was no qualifying language, no careful hedging. "I should have tried harder. I did not, and that is a failure I cannot undo. What I can do is give you back what was taken. The northern parcel is still titled in my name. I can sign it back to you." "I should have done it already." The silence that followed this was different from the earlier silence. It had weight and texture. Clarence stared at the barn floor for a long time. "Eleanor," he said finally, "that was all." "I know," Edwin said. "You cannot give me that back." "No, I cannot." More silence. Hazel said very quietly, "Mr. Potts, is there family, children?" Clarence looked at her as if he had briefly forgotten she was there. "A son," he said. "Thomas, he's 20, working in Cheyenne now." "The land," Hazel said. "It would mean something for him." Clarence looked at her a long time. Something in his face was working, shifting, a man trying to find a position he could live with. "You did not know any of this," he said to her. It was not an accusation, it was almost gentle. "I did not," she said. "I have known this man for 6 days." Something flickered in Clarence's eyes, almost a recognition, almost a sad amusement. "Hell of a 6 days," he said. "It has been eventful," she agreed. The gun lay on the hay beside him, forgotten now, which was its own kind of resolution. Edwin and Clarence talked for another 2 hours, out on the porch eventually, where Hazel brought them coffee and then left them to it, because some conversations need privacy to do their full work. She sat at the kitchen table and listened to the low sound of their voices through the closed door and thought about what she had just witnessed and what it had revealed to her. She thought about the fact that Edwin had not lied, not when the gun was at his head, and lying would have been the expedient choice. Not afterward, when he could have minimized or shifted the blame entirely to Crail, who deserved a significant portion of it. He had taken his share of the responsibility and held it and not let it go, and she had watched him do it and understood that she was looking at the inside of a person's character, the part that only shows itself under pressure. She did not know if she forgave him exactly. She was not sure forgiveness was hers to give. The harm had been Clarence's, and the forgiveness would have to come from Clarence if it came at all. But she knew what she thought of him. She knew more certainly than she had known anything in a long time. Clarence Potts left before midnight, his horse's hoofbeats fading down the dark road toward Brentwood. Edwin stood on the porch and watched him go, and then he stood there in the cold for a while longer before he came back inside. He found Hazel still at the kitchen table. She had poured herself a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold and was turning it between her hands without drinking it. He sat down across from her. He looked exhausted in the way that has nothing to do with sleep, the exhaustion of having carried something heavy for a very long time and having finally, however painfully, set it down. "I should have told you," he said. "Yes," she said. "You should have." "I was going to," he said. "I was trying to find the right time and the right words, and the honest truth is that there is no right time and no right words for something like that, and so I kept not saying it." She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them threw long shadows and made his face look older and younger at the same time. "What would you have told me?" she asked. "If you had told me before tonight." He was quiet for a moment. Then carefully, "That I made an error that cost a man his home and possibly more than that, and that I have been trying to correct it and failing, and that it is the thing I am most ashamed of in my life, and that I thought you should know it before you made any permanent decisions. So you plan to tell me." "I plan to tell you," he confirmed. She nodded slowly. "All right," he looked at her. "All right. I am not saying it was nothing," she said. "It was not nothing. And you are going to sign that land back to Clarence Potts, Edwin, and you are going to do it by the end of the week. And then I would like you to write a letter to Robert Crail explaining in precise terms what his conduct cost a family and what you think of it." "I already sent that letter," Edwin said, 14 months ago." "Good," she said. "Then we have a foundation." He stared at her for a moment. The expression on his face was one she had not yet seen from him and would come to love above almost all others, a kind of unguarded openness, like a door blown wide by unexpected wind. "You are remarkable," he said. He did not say it flirtatiously or with any intent beyond pure simple statement of observed fact, and that was exactly what made it detonate quietly in the center of her chest. "I am practical," she said. "It is a different thing." "Not always," he said. They sat together in the kitchen for another hour, talking in the way they had talked at dinner at McCarthy's on the day of their wedding, not filling silence but using it thoughtfully, each word earning its place. She asked him about Crail, about the land transaction, about what he had done to try to make it right. He told her everything, the way a man confesses not because he must but because he wants to be known by someone, and has decided, with a gravity she could feel through the table, that the someone he wants to be known by is her. At some point near midnight she became aware that the space between them at the table was smaller than it had been, as if they had both been leaning forward by tiny increments without deciding to, drawn by the same pull that rivers have toward low ground. "I should let you sleep," he said, not moving. "Probably," she agreed, also not moving. He looked at her with those careful dark eyes, and she thought, "I have been waiting 26 years for someone to look at me like I am a country they want to learn the geography of and are not in any hurry about it." "Hazel," he said. "Edwin," she said, "I am very glad you answered that advertisement." She felt warmth move through her like sunlight through glass. "So am I," she said. Over the following weeks, the thing between them built the way things build when two careful people who have been hurt by incaution are allowing themselves, slowly and deliberately, to trust the ground beneath them. He drove into Brentwood 2 days after the night with Clarence Potts and came back with a land attorney, and by the end of the week the northern parcel had been red-idled in Clarence Potts's name. He sent a letter to Cheyenne for Thomas Potts, Clarence's son, explaining what had been done, and that the land was available whenever the family wished to return to it. He did not ask for gratitude or forgiveness. He simply did what was right and left the rest to other people's conscience. She watched him do all of this and felt something in her chest that she was not quite ready to call love yet, because she was a careful person and love seemed like a word that wanted to be sure of itself before it was spoken aloud. Tom, one of the ranch hands, taught her to ride properly. She had ridden before, gently and Eastern style on a civilized horse in a park, but riding in Wyoming was a fundamentally different enterprise involving hills and uneven terrain, and animals with opinions. Solomon watched her lessons from his stall, with what she could only describe as critical interest. Edwin appeared at the paddock fence on her third lesson and watched without comment for a while, then said, when she pulled up beside him, "You're not afraid of it." "I have found," she said, patting the lesson horse, a calm bay named Mrs. Thursday, "that being afraid of horses is less useful than being interested in them." He smiled. It was the third full smile she had seen from him, and like the previous two, it transformed his face in a way that made her want to study it for longer than was probably appropriate. "Mrs. Thursday," he said. "Tom named her." "Tom has a gift for nomenclature," she said, and he laughed, which was even better than the smile. In the evenings they developed a habit. After supper, which she had gradually taken over from the rotating and somewhat chaotic previous arrangement among the ranch hands, they would sit on the side porch if the weather permitted, and Wyoming in October was still generous with clear evenings, and she would read and he would read, occasionally sharing a passage aloud if something struck one of them. It was the most companionable silence she had ever experienced, and she thought sometimes that she could live inside it forever. One evening she read aloud a passage from Middlemark about the growing good of the world depending on unhistoric acts, and she looked up and found him watching her with that expression again, the one he controlled quickly but not quickly enough. "Sorry," she said. "I know I tend to editorialize through my reading voice." "I was not objecting," he said carefully. She looked at him for a moment. "Edwin." "Hazel," she took a breath. "When you placed that advertisement," she said, "what were you hoping for?" Truly, not practically. What were you hoping a partner would be? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Then someone who would tell me when I was wrong," he said. "Someone I could tell the truth to. Someone who would," he paused, chose words with the precision she had come to recognize as his particular care, "fill in the parts of a life that go quiet when there is no one there to share them with." She felt her throat tighten in a way that was not unpleasant. "That is what I hoped too," she said softly. "More or less." He reached across the space between their chairs and put his hand on the railing that she was resting her hand on, not touching but close enough that she could feel the warmth of it. An invitation rather than an assumption. She turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his, and they stayed like that, watching the stars come out over the Wyoming hills until the cold drove them inside. Nothing more was said about it that night. But in the morning, when he left the coffee made and went out to start the day's work, she found on the kitchen table beside the coffee cup a small wildflower that must have been saved from somewhere, pressed flat and dried, the kind of thing that had been sitting in a book and was now being offered. No note, just the flower. She stood over it for a long time. She put it in her copy of Middlemark, between the pages where the passage she had read aloud was printed. October deepened into a Wyoming November, and the cold came down from the mountains with purpose and authority. The ranch work intensified in the particular way that pre-winter always intensifies ranch work: cattle to be moved and winter feed to be laid in and fence lines to be checked, and 100 other tasks that Edwin oversaw with the quiet, efficient energy she had come to admire in him. He worked harder than his men and did not make a performance of it. He simply worked. She was not idle. She had begun keeping the ranch accounts, having discovered that the previous system was a loosely organized disaster that Edwin had been managing with a combination of memory and optimism. She reorganized everything into a proper ledger system, identified 3 places where they were being overcharged by suppliers in Brentwood, and had renegotiated one of the contracts before Edwin even knew she had started. He came home to find her at the desk in the office with 3 months of invoices arranged by supplier and category, and looked at it for a long time. "You did this," he said. "The previous system was creative," she said diplomatically. "It was terrible," he said. "I knew it was terrible. I never had time to fix it." "Well," she said, "now you do not have to." He looked at the organized ledger and then at her and then at the ledger again. "Hazel," he said. "Yes. I want to say something, and I want to say it correctly." She put down her pen and gave him her full attention. He had both hands in his pockets and was looking at her with that open, careful expression she had learned to read, the one that meant he was about to say something that mattered. "I have been trying very hard," he said, "not to say things before I was sure of them, because I have found that saying things before you are sure of them is one of the more reliable ways of making a mess. But I am sure of this. I am," and here he took a breath, "I am in love with you, Hazel. I have been, I think, since somewhere around the 2nd letter. And I am saying it now because you deserve to know it, and because I have been carrying it for long enough that it has started to affect my concentration, and you just organized my accounts, so the least I can do is be honest about my state of mind." She stared at him. In the firelight of the office he looked both very composed and completely undone, a combination she had not previously thought possible. She stood up from the desk and crossed the room to him and took his face in her hands, which seemed to surprise him considerably, and she said, "Edwin Bishop, I have been in love with you since you pressed a gun to your own head rather than lie to a man who deserved the truth." "The gun was pressed by Clarence," he said a little hoarsely. "Do not be pedantic," she said, and then she kissed him. The first time they kissed it was brief and careful and extraordinarily eloquent, the kind of kiss that communicates an entire vocabulary of things that neither of them had found adequate words for. When she stepped back she was warm to her fingertips, and he was looking at her with an expression she was quite certain she would never get tired of. "Well," he said. "Yes," she said. "I should have been less composed," he said thoughtfully. "Much sooner." She laughed, and the sound of it in the quiet house felt like a window being opened in a room that had been shut too long. November brought snow, which it turned out was Wyoming's manner of reminding everyone that it was entirely in charge of the situation. The first snowfall came overnight, and Hazel woke to a world that had been completely revised, while she slept white and still and blazing with the kind of light that comes only when everything reflects sky at you simultaneously. She stood at her bedroom window and stared at it and felt, unexpectedly, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Edwin appeared in the hallway with coffee and saw her at the window and came to stand beside her, handing her the cup, both of them looking out at the transformed landscape. "First Wyoming winter," he said. "It is extraordinary," she said. "It gets considerably less charming by February," he warned. "Everything gets less charming by February," she said. "Even February." He laughed, which still had the ability to make her feel like she had accomplished something genuinely notable. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him and they drank their coffee watching the white world outside, and she thought, all those years of being careful and waiting for the thing that was real, and this is what real feels like. This precisely. Not the dramatic moments, not the barn and the gun and the revelation, though those two had been part of it, part of the shaping. But this. Coffee and snow and a person standing beside you who knows who you are and is not going anywhere. The following weeks brought a steady deepening of everything, their daily rhythms more intertwined, their conversations longer and more unbuttoned, their silences richer. She moved her books to the larger study where his were, and the shelves held both collections now, a mingling that seemed to please both of them out of proportion to its practical significance. He made room without being asked. That too seemed significant. She wrote to her cousin in Kansas City, not to explain or justify, but to say that she was well and happy, and that the West was not what she had imagined. It was larger and colder and more demanding, and also more genuinely itself than she had expected. She received a letter back that was surprised in all the ways that told her the cousin had expected the marriage to be a disaster. She did not feel the need to gloat, but she did feel a warm, private satisfaction. There was a Christmas social in Brentwood in December, held at the church, and Hazel went with Edwin and met the people who made up the fabric of the town and its surroundings, the Hendersons who ran the general store, the Alvarez family who had a sheep operation to the south, and whose daughter Maria was Hazel's age, and became almost immediately a genuine friend. The doctor named Purvis, who was competent and plain-spoken, and asked Hazel within 5 minutes of meeting her whether she had a practical skill beyond managing a household, which she took to mean he was short of help, and had heard she had an organizing mind. She helped him reorganize his patient records the following week, out of something that began as curiosity and became genuine interest. She had always had a facility for systems, for seeing the pattern in scattered information, and medicine, it turned out, had a great deal of scattered information that wanted organizing. Dr. Purvis, whose first name was Elias and who was 60-something, and had the manner of a man who had been unimpressed by the universe for several decades but had not given up on it, watched her rebuild his filing system and said, "You are wasted keeping accounts." "I am also keeping accounts," she said. "You could be a nurse," he said. Formally. "There is a school in Cheyenne. I could write a letter." She filed this under things to think about and returned to Edwin that evening thoughtful. "Elias Purvis wants to recommend me for nursing training," she said over supper. Edwin looked up from his plate. His expression was interested, not guarded. "In Cheyenne? Yes, it would be months away." She watched his face. "When were you thinking?" he asked. "I have not decided anything," she said. "I was telling you about it." "What do you want?" he asked. It was a simple question delivered with perfect sincerity, and she realized she was slightly unprepared for it for a husband whose first response to her potential ambition was to ask what she wanted. "I think," she said slowly, "that I would like to do something that uses the parts of me that accounts and housekeeping do not fully reach. I think Dr. Purvis is right that there is an aptitude there. I also think I do not want to leave here for months." She looked at him. "Which is information I have only had access to since arriving here." "Cheyenne has stage access," he said. "I could visit. You could come home between sessions if the schedule permits." She looked at him. "You would support this?" "Of course I would support this," he said, slightly surprised by the question. "Hazel, you are a person with a mind, and the mind wants work that is equal to it. That seems obvious." She reached across the table and took his hand, and he turned it over and held hers with the quiet certainty she had come to rely on, and she thought, "I am going to love this man for the rest of my life. I am going to do it with my whole self, and I am not going to be careful about it at all." In January, A letter arrived from Thomas Potts in Cheyenne, Clarence's son. It was addressed to Edwin, and it was not long. It said that Thomas had shown the letter about the land to his father, and that Clarence had initially refused to look at it, and that it had taken 3 weeks and the intervention of Thomas himself to persuade Clarence to read it fully, and that having read it, Clarence had sat quietly for a long time, and then said that he supposed what was done, and that a man who tried to set things right was better than one who did not. It was not forgiveness exactly, Thomas wrote, but it was the closest his father had come to peace in 2 years, and Thomas wanted Edwin to know that, and that in the spring they planned to go look at the land. Edwin read the letter at the kitchen table and then put it down and looked at the middle distance for a moment. Hazel put her hand on his shoulder. He covered it with his own. "It is not the same as all of it being all right," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it is the beginning of it being livable." "Yes," he said, "that is exactly it." Winter deepened and the snow piled against the window frames, and the cold was the kind that makes the world feel sealed. And inside the sealed world of the ranch, Edwin and Hazel Bishop settled into each other with the ease of 2 people who were discovering, day by day, that the fit was better than either of them had dared to believe possible. He told her about his childhood in Ohio, about a father who was hard and decent and not given to warmth, but who had taught him the value of doing what you said you would do. She told him about the bookshop, about her father's particular genius for finding books that people did not know they needed, and somehow always having exactly the right one at the right moment. She told him about the years of steady narrowing after her father died, the debts, the cousin's offer, the sense of a life closing in, and about finding the advertisement folded in the Harper's Weekly and the feeling, the specific inexplicable feeling that it had been put there deliberately for her, which she knew was not rational but which she had learned not to argue with. "I nearly did not place it," he admitted one evening. They were in the study, fire going, snow against the windows. "I wrote it and then I left it for 2 weeks and then I wrote it again and I still nearly did not send it." "What made you send it?" He considered. "Solomon," he said. She looked at him. "The horse." "I was talking to Solomon about it," Edwin said. He was almost but not entirely embarrassed, as one does, and he looked at me the way he does when I am being extremely dense about something obvious. She was laughing. "You took romantic advice from a horse." "Solomon is very perceptive," Edwin said with dignity. "I am going to give that horse an apple every day for the rest of his life," she said. "He will expect it now," Edwin said. "You understand that? You have raised his sense of entitlement to dangerous levels." She laughed and leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat like that while the fire did its work, and the snow fell silently outside, and the world inside was warm and full of everything it needed. By February, she had made her decision about the nursing training. She had written to the school in Cheyenne and received a response indicating that a spring session would begin in April, and that Dr. Purvis's letter of recommendation was strong enough that her admission was effectively certain. She showed Edwin the letter and they talked about it practically and thoroughly, the way they talked about everything, how long the sessions would run, what the schedule looked like, whether she could come home during the breaks, what it would mean for the ranch accounts in the meantime. "I can manage the accounts," he said. "I managed them before." "Barely," she said. "Adequately," he said. "There is a difference." "I will write a detailed explanation of the system before I go," she said, "and you will follow it exactly." "I will do my best," he said. "Edwin, I will follow it exactly," he said. She went to Cheyenne in April, and the parting was harder than either of them had prepared for. He drove her to the stage in Brentwood and loaded her trunk, and they stood in the street in the early morning cold, and she looked at him and felt a pull in her chest that was almost physical, a resistance, a thing that wanted to go back. "I will write immediately," she said. "So will I," he said. "Edwin. Hazel." He kissed her, right there on the main street of Brentwood at 7 in the morning, with Tom and Gideon and Alfie pretending not to watch from the buckboard. It was not a brief, careful kiss this time. It was the kind of kiss that says, I know where you are going, and I know you are coming back, and I am going to be here with extraordinary patience until you do." When she stepped back, her face was warm, and she was aware of Alfie heroically suppressing something behind her, but she did not care in the slightest. "March," she said. That was how long the first session was. "March," he confirmed. She got on the stage. He watched it until it was out of sight. Cheyenne was exactly the city that the rest of Wyoming was not, loud and packed and full of the industry and chaos of a territorial capital that was growing faster than its infrastructure could handle. The nursing school was connected to the territorial hospital and run by a formidable woman named Superintendent Clara Marsh, who had trained in the East and brought with her a set of standards and an unwillingness to compromise on them that Hazel recognized and respected immediately. The work was difficult and occasionally harrowing, and deeply satisfying in the way that only things are satisfying when they demand the full use of your capabilities. She was good at it. She had known she would be, and being confirmed in that knowledge was its own particular pleasure. She learned wound care and medication management and patient assessment, and the particular skill of remaining calm when bodies were doing alarming things, which it turned out she had a natural talent for. Clara Marsh told her at the end of the second week that she had one of the steadiest nerves of any student she had taught, which Hazel suspected had something to do with being raised in a bookshop where the emergencies were mostly about inventory. Edwin's letters arrived every 10 days with the regularity of a man who took commitment seriously. They were long letters, longer than his early courtship letters had been, less careful, more himself. He told her about Solomon's escalating apple demands. He told her about a dispute with a neighboring rancher, about a fence line that he had resolved through the radical method of inviting the man to supper and talking about it for 3 hours. He told her about Alfie falling spectacularly in love with Maria Alvarez's younger sister Catalina, and the resulting comedy of a 19-year-old ranch hand attempting to present himself as a figure of dignity and accomplishment while failing at approximately 40% of daily tasks due to distraction. He told her that the house was too quiet. She wrote back, "I know, but I can hear it differently now. I can hear it as the thing that will be filled when I come back, and that is better than silence." He wrote back, "I had not thought of it that way. This is why I needed a partner with a mind equal to the situation." She folded that letter and put it with all the others. In June, she came home for 2 weeks between sessions, and the reunion was the kind of quiet joy that people who read about romance in novels sometimes dismiss as insufficient, because there are no dramatics in it and no speech. Only the two of them standing in the kitchen where he had dinner already made and the coffee on, and his face doing that open, unguarded thing that meant he was too glad to manage his expression properly. And her walking straight to him and putting her arms around him and feeling him hold her with the completeness of someone who had been waiting. "The accounts," she said into his shoulder. "Are fine," he said. "Let me see them." "Tomorrow," he said. "Tonight they are definitely fine." She laughed and held on and thought that she had been right about everything she had felt standing in the snow at her bedroom window in November. This was real. This was the real thing, and she was going to hold on to it for as long as there was holding to be done. Those 2 weeks she helped with a difficult calving, met Maria Alvarez for coffee 3 times, wrote 2 reports for the nursing school, organized the summer ranch accounts, and spent every available evening on the side porch with Edwin watching the long Wyoming summer light die slowly over the hills. They talked about the future, practically and also with the lightness that comes when the future is a thing you want rather than dread. She would finish the training by September. She had spoken with Dr. Purvis, who was very interested in establishing a more formal arrangement where she would work at his office part-time. It would bring in income independent of the ranch, which mattered to her, not because she distrusted Edwin's management, but because she had promised herself, after her father's debts and her cousin's conditional charity, that she would never be entirely dependent on another person's resources. "Good," Edwin said when she told him. "You are not the slightest bit concerned about your wife working outside the home?" she asked, watching him with slight amusement because she had met men in Cheyenne who would have been. "I am concerned," he said seriously, "about you being happy. The working outside the home seems directly relevant to that goal." She kissed him for that. Thoroughly. "Also," he said, when they were sitting back and she was watching the sunset with the satisfied expression of someone whose life was going in the right direction, "I had an idea." "Tell me." "The bookshop," he said. "Your father's." She looked at him. "It was sold to pay the debts." "I know," he said, "not that specific one. But Brentwood does not have a bookshop. It has a general store with a 3-shelf section of almanacs and penny dreadfuls and I think one Bible. It does not have a real bookshop." She stared at him. "Edwin, there is a building on the main street that Hendersons have been trying to let for 6 months," he said. "It is the right size. I have been thinking about it since November." I did not want to say anything because I did not want it to seem like I was trying to direct what you did with yourself. "But you have been thinking about your father's shop. I know you have. And I think this is a thing that could work." She was quiet for a moment, feeling something unfold in her chest that was too large and too warm for the available space. "You have been holding this since November," she said. "I wanted to say it at the right time," he said, "which is apparently June on the porch watching the sunset." She turned to him with the fullness of everything she felt and said, "Edwin Bishop, you are the finest man I have ever known." He looked at her, and in the warm evening light she could see exactly what that meant to him. "Partner," he said. "Partner," she confirmed. She went back to Cheyenne for the final session in July and finished in September, as planned, with the highest marks in her cohort and a formal certificate and a letter from Superintendent Clara Marsh that said she had the makings of an exceptional practitioner and that the Wyoming Territory was fortunate to have her. She came home in September to a world that had turned gold with autumn again, 1 full year after she had first arrived on a stage with a trunk and $42 and a carefully guarded hope. He met her at the Brentwood stage depot, as he had the first time, but this time when she stepped down he did not shake her hand. He stepped forward and lifted her off the step and held her, and she laughed against his neck and held on. Dr. Purvis hired her officially starting the following week. She began working 3 days a week at his office and discovered, precisely as she had expected, that the work was exactly what her mind needed, and the town needed her more than it had known. Within 2 months she had delivered 2 babies. She had not technically been trained as a midwife, but the training overlapped in sufficient practical ways, and the alternative in both cases was no qualified help at all, and treated the full range of frontier maladies, and developed a reputation as the person to see if you wanted both competence and someone who would explain what was happening to you rather than simply doing things and expecting you to be grateful. The bookshop happened in October. She and Edwin leased the building from the Hendersons and spent 3 weekends rebuilding the shelving, which Edwin did with careful precision, and she directed with equal precision, and they argued cheerfully about the height of the upper shelves for the better part of an afternoon before he admitted she was right. She wrote to every book dealer she had known through her father's trade and ordered an initial stock with a combination of ranch profits and her own nursing income. The morning she opened the shop, she called it simply Wainwright Books because that was what it was, and she saw no reason to be clever about it. Nearly 40 people came through the door, which in a town of 400 was a genuinely notable event. She sold 27 books on opening day, including, improbably, 2 copies of Middlemark. Edwin stood at the back of the shop, watching the town of Brentwood exclaim over shelves of books, and her face was bright and alive with a particular joy that he had seen her face carry in various measures over the past year, but never quite this fully and completely. And he thought that this was the best thing he had ever been part of, this life, this particular building of something real with this particular woman. He had not thought, when he wrote that advertisement, that it was possible to be this precisely met. He had hoped for something functional and perhaps over time warm. He had not imagined this. This was not a thing he had known how to imagine. She looked up from behind the counter and found him watching, and she smiled. The full, wide smile that she had learned to use without guarding. And he shook his head slightly, as if still mildly astonished by the fact of her, which she suspected he would continue to be for the rest of their lives. That evening, after the shop closed and all the congratulations had been given, and Maria Alvarez had embraced her, and Alfie, now officially courting Catalina with a degree of focused effort that was genuinely heartwarming, had bought a book of poetry that Hazel was 90% certain he did not intend to read. She locked up and walked with Edwin back through the autumn streets to where the buckboard waited, and they drove home through the dark with the stars enormous above them. "Solomon is expecting a full report," Edwin said. "Tell him it was a success," she said. "He will be insufferably satisfied," Edwin said. "He has been taking credit for all of this." She laughed and leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they drove through the Wyoming night. And she thought about the Harper's Weekly advertisement folded inside the cover of a book, and about a train platform and a trunk and $42, and about the particular mysterious machinery by which people find their way to the lives they are meant for. Spring came again, the second spring, and with it came a piece of news that Hazel delivered to Edwin on a Sunday morning in May with a combination of nervousness and a joy so large it made her voice unsteady. He was at the kitchen table with his coffee and the account she had left him to check, and she came and sat across from him and said his name, and something in her tone made him put down the papers and look at her fully. She told him. His face moved through several things rapidly. First, a very still moment, the kind that precedes understanding. Then understanding itself, traveling from mind to chest, and she watched it arrive with the particular undisguised helplessness of a man who is feeling something too large to manage into composure. He got up from the table and came around to her and went down on one knee beside her chair and took both her hands in both of his and did not say anything for a moment, just held her hands and looked at her with everything he had. "Edwin," she said softly, "say something." "I am trying to find the right words," he said, which was so characteristic of him that she felt tears come to her eyes, "and I keep arriving at the same ones." "Tell me," she said. "I love you," he said. "I am going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worth this." She leaned down and put her forehead against his. "You already are," she said. "You have been since the second letter." They sat like that in the May morning light, hands clasped, foreheads together, the kitchen full of coffee and quiet, and the enormous good news of a life expanding. The pregnancy was straightforward. She was healthy and said so herself with a nurse's practical authority, and Edwin fussed anyway with a constrained and dignified anxiety that she found absolutely adorable and told him so, which made him look simultaneously embarrassed and pleased. Dr. Purvis managed her care with the matter-of-fact competence that was his dominant mode, and told her she was among the most sensible patients he had ever treated, which from Elias Purvis was high praise. She continued working at the shop and at Dr. Purvis's office into October, which caused some comment in the town from those who held traditional opinions about such things, and she listened to the opinions with polite attention, and then continued exactly as before, which was as much as she was prepared to give the question. Edwin told one man who ventured an opinion at the general store that his wife was a trained medical professional, and he was enormously proud of her, and that was the end of the conversation. And Tom, who had been there, came home and reported it to Gideon and Alfie with the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed something genuinely correct. Their son was born on a Tuesday in December, in the bedroom of the ranch house, with Dr. Purvis attending and Edwin present because she had said she wanted him there, and he had not argued. She named him Samuel, after her father whose middle name it had been, and Edwin held him first. She insisted on this because Edwin's face when he held his son for the first time was something she had wanted to see, and it did not disappoint. It was the single most complete expression of joy she had ever witnessed on a human face, quiet and whole and unwavering, like a lamp in a window that has finally found what it was put there for. She lay back with the relief and weight of it all and watched Edwin with Samuel and thought, this is the life, this exact life. Alfie married Catalina Alvarez in the spring of the following year, a wedding that the entire surrounding community attended and which featured food from the Alvarez family that was the best Hazel had eaten since coming to Wyoming, and dancing that lasted until nearly midnight. Edwin danced with her, which she had not previously known he could do, with a natural quiet ease that she found deeply unfair given the years she had spent at Eastern social functions partnered with men who could not find the beat. "You never told me you could dance," she said. "You never asked," he said. "I am noting this for future reference," she said. "You have been withholding useful information." "The opposite," he said. "I have been saving it." She laughed and let him spin her and thought that there were still, after 18 months of marriage, things to discover about this person she had chosen, and that this was entirely and completely wonderful. In August, a letter arrived from Clarence Potts. It was addressed to both of them, which Hazel noted. He wrote that he and Thomas had returned to the northern parcel in May, and had spent the summer making it livable again. He wrote that it was hard work and good work, and that the land was in better condition than he had feared. He did not say he had forgiven Edwin. He said that Thomas was a man worth being proud of, and that the land gave Thomas something solid to build on, and that he supposed that was what mattered. He said that a leaner would have been glad the land came back to the family. That was all. But it was enough. It was more than enough. Edwin read the letter and then walked outside with it, and stood on the porch for a while. Hazel found him there later and stood beside him and did not say anything, because sometimes the only right thing to do is stand beside someone while they feel the thing they are feeling. After a while he said, "I think I can stop carrying it now." "Yes," she said. "I do not mean I am done thinking about it. I just mean, I know what you mean," she said. "It is different now." "Yes," he said. "It is different." She slid her hand into his, and they stood on the porch looking at the summer ranch. The big Wyoming sky, Solomon moving in his paddock with his customary air of owning the property, the hills going gold and green in the evening light. Samuel was inside with Tom's wife Agnes, who had taken to him with the enthusiasm of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this level of cuteness, and was making the most of it. Life was full. Life was extraordinarily full. That winter was the mildest in 3 years, and the cattle operation had its best season to date, and the bookshop had established itself as one of the better-known establishments in the county, with customers coming from as far as 40 miles, and a small but growing mail-order business that Hazel ran with the same systematic pleasure she brought to everything she organized. She had 3 standing accounts with dealers in Chicago now, and the Brentwood Gazette had run a story about the shop that had generated letters from 4 other towns asking if she would consider opening branches, which she found flattering and impractical, and had filed under things to consider in about 5 years when Samuel was older. In the second spring, Edwin came home from a trip to Cheyenne, where he had gone to register some land documents, with a package under his arm that he presented to her at supper with the careful casual expression he used when he was actually not casual at all. Inside the package were 12 books, all first editions, all from the inventory of Ascent. Louis bookshop that had been sold the previous year, a shop called Wainwright's that had apparently come through an estate liquidation and ended up in the hands of a Cheyenne dealer who had been trying to place them at fair value with someone who would know what they were. She sat at the table with the books in front of her and could not speak for a full minute. Her father's shop, her father's books, not all of them, not most of them, but 12 of them, sitting on her table in Wyoming, found. Edwin sat across from her with the expression of a man who had done something he knew was right, and was waiting to hear the verdict. She looked up at him, and the tears on her face were not the sad kind, though there was sadness in them, as there is sadness in all recovered things. They were the kind that come when something lost comes back transformed, smaller than it was, but real and yours. "How did you?" she started. "I asked the dealer in Cheyenne to watch for them," he said. "After you told me about your father's shop, he found them in March." She pressed her hands flat on the books and breathed. "Edwin," she said. "Yes. I love you in a way that I do not have adequate vocabulary for." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I think that is something we have in common." She got up from the table and went around to him, and he pushed the chair back and she sat in his lap, and he put his arms around her, and she held on to him in the kitchen, while Samuel slept upstairs, and the fire ticked in the hearth, and the Wyoming night lay quietly around the house. And she thought about all the ways that a life can be more than you planned for, more than you dared to ask for, more real and more particular and more genuinely itself than the imagination can prefigure. She had come here with $42 and a feeling she could not explain. She had found a man who told the truth under duress and danced when you did not expect it, and saved the books of her father's shop, because she had mentioned them once in the dark of a long evening. She had found a town that needed what she knew, and a shop that carried her father's name, and a practice that used the parts of her that most needed using. She had found Samuel, who at 14 months was conducting his own systematic investigation of the universe that reminded her, in the best possible way, of both of them. She had found, she thought, everything. The following October, 2 years and 1 month after the day she had stepped off the stage in Brentwood with dust on her coat and hope in her chest, Hazel stood in the garden behind the house in the slant autumn light and watched Edwin teach Samuel to walk in the grass. Samuel was extremely focused on the enterprise, doing the determined wobbling work of a new walker with total concentration and the occasional consultation of his father's hands for balance. Edwin was patient and funny and gentle, letting Samuel find his own weight, ready to catch but not intercepting until the interception was actually needed. She stood in the light and watched them and felt the afternoon in her bones, the smell of autumn grass and wood smoke from the house, and the distant sound of the horses in the paddock and Solomon's periodic commentary on everything. She had her father's books in the shop, and her nursing certificate on the wall and the accounts in proper order, and a marriage that felt every day more like the best conversation she had ever been in the middle of, and did not want to stop. Edwin looked up and found her watching, which he always seemed to know when she was doing, and he smiled the full open smile that she had counted now at over 200 instances and still found to be the finest sight in Wyoming. Samuel, finding his father momentarily distracted, sat down with a decisive thump in the grass and regarded the sky above him with great interest. Hazel walked across the garden to them and sat down in the grass beside Samuel, who immediately attempted to convey to her something very important about a beetle he had found, and Edwin sat beside her, and the three of them occupied the afternoon grass together in the golden October light, the ranch working around them, the big sky overhead, the world in full and proper order, and every promise kept. That was the life. That was all of it, and all of it was enough. She would tell Samuel the story one day, the advertisement, the train, the barn and the lantern and the gun, Clarence Potts and a leaner, and the land that came back. She would tell him about letters that crossed 2,000 miles to find each other. She would tell him that the world had a way, sometimes, of folding the right two people toward each other if they were willing to be honest about what they needed, and that honesty was not the same as being unafraid. It was doing the true thing while the fear was still there. She would tell him that his father was the finest man she had ever known, and that she had known it before she could have articulated why, which was not logic, but was also not nothing. She would tell him that the West was hard and large and full of injustice and beauty in equal and bewildering measure, and that the best you could do was your part, fair dealing, honest work, being willing to face what you had done wrong and try to make it right. She would tell him that his grandmother's bookshop lived on a shelf in Brentwood, Wyoming, and that books were the thing that had started all of it, because a man had written an advertisement that was different from all the other advertisements, and a woman had read it in a public library in St. Louis and felt a warm, cold lodge in her chest and refused to argue with it. For now, in the October grass, she did not tell him any of it. He was 14 months old and investigating a beetle with the full force of his considerable intellect, and she was leaning against Edwin's shoulder, and Edwin's hand was in her hair, and the afternoon was doing the particular work of late October afternoons, which is to make everything feel amber and permanent and full. Solomon, from his paddock, offered an opinion about something. Alfie shouted a response from the direction of the barn. Tom's wife Agnes called from the back porch that supper was nearly ready. The ordinary music of a life that was, in every way that mattered, exactly what it was supposed to be. Edwin turned his head and pressed a kiss to her temple, slow and certain, the kind of kiss that means I am here and I am not going anywhere and I know what I have. She closed her eyes and breathed the autumn and the smoke and the grass. "Edwin," she said. "Hazel," he said. That was enough. That was all of it. That was everything.